Okay, looks like we're live. Welcome to BenThere. This is season 2, episode 8. I am incredibly excited about this. This guest that I have today, he was those of you that usually watch the show, you'll understand third culture kids, and he was a TCK before TCK were cool. I guess that's what I like to say right now. I can't wait to talk about this with him, and I can't wait to pick his brain and hear his life story. Thank you all for watching, no matter where you're watching, wherever you are. Also, those of you that are watching or listening, I should say, on the podcast. But thank you so much for doing that. This is going to be a treat today. I can't wait to get to this. My guest today, he's got a story to tell. Let's put it that way. I'm gonna get right to it and let him kind of talk about himself. But Mr. Barry Barnes, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to pick your brain. I used to think of myself as someone who was an old timer TCK, but you, like I said, man, earlier you put the cool in TCK before most people knew about it. So, welcome to the show, Barry. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
No
Glad
problem.
to be here.
Absolutely. Well, look, I usually start these off. I'm sure you've seen the show. We usually start these off by just allowing the guests to kind of talk about themselves, and I always say brag. Nobody likes to hear that term, but I want you to. I want you to brag about yourself. So if you don't mind, tell us everything, man. Summarize your upbringing, where your family's originally from, where you lived growing up, how your family ended up overseas, your college days, and obviously where you are now, if you don't mind. So, Barry, it's all you.
Okay, well, I come from very humble beginnings. My father was born in the hollers of Arkansas in a one-room log cabin.
Wow.
When he was 7 years old, he walked for 3 weeks beside a covered wagon to Oklahoma. And these were truly poor people. His parents were sharecropper farmers in Oklahoma. And my mother, they were slightly more affluent. She grew up on a large farm that her father actually owned. And they met when they were 5 and 7 years old, respectively, at what was called a brush arbor revival, which was, these fundamentalists get together back then. And the preacher was a fire and brimstone preacher, and they played together. And then they didn't see each other again until they were in high school. And they got married when she was 21 and dad was, no, I guess she was 22 and dad was 19.
Oh, wow.
And he had joined, when he got out of the high school, there were no jobs at all. This was during the Depression. And so he went to California and picked grapes and other vegetables and joined the Civilian Conservation Corps and built bridges and this and that and the other in California and Oregon. And that got tiring. And he joined what was then the United States Army Air Corps in, I guess that was in 1939 or 1940. And they got married and shortly thereafter, and their lives changed dramatically. Over the next 28 years of life, they lived in, I don't know how many houses. I lived in 41 houses by the time I was 19, and they obviously lived in a few more before I was born. And in numerous states and another country, the Philippine Islands. In that period of time, Dad went from an uneducated Oklahoma farm boy to a guy that had 2 bachelor's degrees and 2 master's degrees. He went from, just doing whatever he was told to being the first commandant in the Air Force who was not an officer. He was a high-ranking NCO, a non-commissioned officer. So my life, I was born into this other culture called the United States Air Force, which was, it was as different from mainstream American culture as you can imagine. In mainstream, so some of the key contrapositives, mainstream U.S. culture is fiercely independent. Air Force culture is follow orders. Mainstream culture is highly capitalistic. Air Force culture is highly socialistic. You live on base, your housing is provided, you get discounts on food and merchandise, free medical care. It's like living in Denmark almost. It's just a
Yeah.
very, very different experience. And you grow up with kids and families, but mostly, as a kid, you're focused on other kids who have lived all over the world. So you're getting third culture influences even before you move overseas. It's the norm. I mean, every kid has lived somewhere else, a lot of them many places else. And by the time you're in high school, you're running into people you've known far away. I lived in the Philippine Islands when I was a teenager, and a squadron was transferred in from Okinawa, which is a part of Japan. And this kid, they usually in military schools used a buddy system when new kids are transferred in so that they won't feel so alone. And this kid sat next to me. His name was familiar. His face was familiar. And for a couple of weeks, we were trying to figure out where we had known each other. And it turned out we had sat across the aisle from each other in a small town in South Texas called Seguin, Texas, when we were in the first grade.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah.
And then my best friend that I'm still friends with from 60 years ago, we met when we were juniors in high school. A close friend of his, he had known when he was in the fifth grade when they both lived in Japan. And then Bob, who's my best friend, later he joined the Air Force, and he ended up being stationed at Clark in the Philippines, where I had lived when I was a teenager.
Small world.
These things happen, it's just constantly like that. So let me check my notes, and because I think I jumped up around a lot.
That's all right. I've got plenty of questions, so don't worry about that. I've got plenty of questions.
My parents, for some reason, had the idea that if we lived off base in when we were in the U.S., that we might do better. Looking back, it was a terrible decision on their behalf. We had nothing in common with local kids.
Yeah.
They, a lot of them had never been, at the young ages, they'd never even been outside of town, much less outside of the county that they lived in. We were already interacting and having experience with kids who had lived all over the world. We knew that we would be living in some other country at some point. Many of these small towns were highly prejudicial against the military. So it was kind of tough. And since my parents were moving so often, it was far tougher for kids like me than it was for other military kids even. So every neighborhood you move into, and the way it is with boys, and I think this is true anywhere in the world with boys, when a new kid shows up, boys want to be challenging. It's the tough guy complex, so you have to prove yourself.
Yeah, that hasn't changed. Yeah, that definitely.
Yeah. And that's sad, but that is the way it is. So we just kept moving around and around. My older brother responded to the challenge. He was only a year and a half older. He always responded to the challenges with his fists. And I usually, that's not my nature, never has been my nature, still isn't my nature. I responded by kind of withdrawing, trying to fit in, finding my niche academically, being liked by teachers, overachieving. It got grudging respect from the other kids. Even sometimes the tough guys or the class bullies would leave a kid like me alone once they realized I just wasn't going to rise to the bait. Right. So we moved around Texas quite a bit. And let me see how to say this without offending anybody. Texas and I didn't fit well.
Well said. Yeah. I think you're safe on that one. Yeah, well played. So.
I did live as an adult for 10 years in Texas, and then I moved to California. And when I met my wife, I was, I was 39 and she was 32. I had some adult kids who lived, or no, they were teenagers then, who lived in Texas by my first marriage. And so I took her back to meet my kids. And she was sitting on my lap, I remember, in the Riverwalk of San Antonio.
Yeah.
And she said, you know, Barry, I really like you and I really think this could go somewhere. But if you ever ask me to move to Texas, it's a deal breaker. And I told her, don't worry, I spent 10 years trying to get out of this state.
I get it. Yeah.
So we had, there were all these moves, and I'm to this day not sure why some of them happened. Mm-hmm. I know that the moves right after World War II, I was born during World War II, right. So it's hard for, I imagine most of the people that would watch or listen to this are younger than me. I'll be 77 next week.
Congrats on that. Yeah. Happy birthday. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Right after World War II, there were no jobs when the men came back from Europe or Japan or, you know, wherever they were, the Asian theater. So men just did whatever came along. And so I can remember my dad briefly working at a carbon plant, and he'd come home from work just literally black. His face would be totally black. He ran a small garage in a tiny little town in Oklahoma for a while. He went back to college, and then my sister was born. I think it was a bit of a surprise birth. The birth wasn't a surprise, the pregnancy was. So he had to drop out of college, and he had gone back on the GI Bill. He rejoined the Air Force.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And so that's, you know, that's when our life, I was born while he was in the Air Force, but then he was out after World War II. And so housing was hard to find. Most people don't know this part of American history. Yeah. My first father-in-law talked about, you know, buying lumber on the black market after World War II to build a tiny little house. Yeah. Things were that scarce, and so people, you know, they would find just anything to live in, and then when a bigger house came along, you know, 2 months later they'd move. Yeah. And I can remember as a little boy, everything we owned fit into a trailer that my dad had built on the chassis of an old pickup truck, and wow. we just, you know, we just kept upgrading and upgrading, and finally, when I was in about 5, they bought a home, and life stabilized quite a bit. So I spent the first and second grade in the same school, and I really liked that. My dad calmed down. He wasn't commuting 40, 50 miles to work in a 20, 30-year-old car. He was calmer as a person, and life was pretty good then. And then we moved on base. And we loved that. They owned that house for 35 more years, and wow. Only lived in it 1 year out of that, you know, beyond the first 2 years.
Yeah.
And so it was just a very transient life. So I think I developed a lot of the third culture kid characteristics before we ever even lived in another country.
Yeah, I'm fascinated about that. Reading your bio, I never even put 2 and 2 together, but yeah, you were obviously living in the States, but it's a different world when you're on a military base, right? That's something I never experienced. We did briefly when I was in Taipei. We'd go to Okinawa actually and stay on a couple of military bases there and play sports and things like that. But I certainly never lived there. So your perspective of that is so much different than mine. I mean, I think, like I said, when I read your bio, you kind of talked about even being on base is almost like being on a different country or in a
It is, yeah. And even to a certain degree, they speak a different language.
Yeah.
It's an English-based language,
Yeah.
but there are so many expressions, and as I'm sure you've observed, the idioms of a language often express its culture.
Yeah.
And the military is loaded with idioms that even when you explain them to non-military people, they often just have a blank look on their faces.
Totally.
And uh, so, so you know, some of the characteristics are the adaptability and flexibility. Those are certainly key characteristics that
Right.
third culture kids have. But also the resourcefulness, the persistence, the perseverance. I think in general, a lot of the research has shown that they tend to have higher levels of creativity and higher needs to express their creativity, and make acquaintances very easily, make friends very sparingly.
Yeah.
When I look back in my life, I see that I've had maybe 4 or 5 actual friends in my entire life, 2 of which I'm still in touch with. But I've had thousands of acquaintances.
I
far more
totally
than
understand that. That's one thing you and I definitely connect on. We're a little bit different in age, but I can relate to that wholeheartedly. Yeah, I get that, man.
yeah.
Yeah.
So finally, when I was finishing the 6th grade, and by the way, my 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, we lived in several different houses during that period, 3, I think, but I went to the same school, and that was a rare experience. I went to a total of 12 schools during my kindergarten through 12th grade, including 3 high schools. One year, I went to 3 different schools in 1 year, which was
That's
a terrible experience. Yeah. But right before the end of the 6th grade, Dad got orders for Germany, and we were excited about that, real excited, and really looking forward to it. And we had taken our shops.
Yeah, where in Germany?
Ramstein, I believe, is the name of the base.
Air base. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There's an air base out there. Yeah.
Right. And we were really excited about it. And we got all of our shots. The house was packed. What few things us kids were allowed to take over there were packed. And 2 weeks before we were to leave, they changed the orders for the Philippine Islands, about as far from Germany as you can get.
Wow. Okay.
So in a period of 3 days, we had to get 21 major shots. 4 in one arm, 3 in the other. The next day, 4 in that, 3 in that arm, 4 in this. Back and forth. And they were bad shots. Really terrible, make you dizzy, make you sick, and sleep the rest of the afternoon shots. But he elected. They had 2 options. It was either a 3-year tour if you took your family for the whole time, or a 2-year tour if your family stayed stateside for a year. And we didn't know anything about the Philippines. And back then, the Air Force didn't do a very good job of prepping personnel about where they were going. Right. And so he elected the 2-year tour. And so the family moved back to South Texas in that home they had bought years earlier. And we stayed stateside for that year while he was over there. And then we went over. And once we all got over, we all wished that he had taken the 3-year tour because we absolutely loved the Philippines.
Yeah. And, where were you in the Philippines? Manila?
We were at Clark Air Base, which is it's in the province of Pampanga. It's about 90 miles from Manila. Okay. It's right. In fact, the volcano that erupted in 1991, Pinatubo, part of it was in Pampanga province, and it wiped out what was Clark Air Base.
Right.
It has since rejuvenated as a Filipino industrial park, air base, airport, and resort center. But then it was just the world's largest air base, U.S. air base.
Right.
We loved the Philippines. We loved the Filipino people, their culture. We traveled all over Luzon Island. A lot of military people, they get transferred overseas and they just stay on base all the time and hang around with fellow Americans. We didn't do that. We really interacted with the culture. I was a teen. I had spent the preceding year independent of my father, which was one of the best things that ever happened to me. My father was a very strong-willed, strict disciplinarian, somewhat overbearing, a man with an indomitable personality. And that the result of a father like that can be very good. You grow up as a strong person, but growing up can be very hard under a man like that. So having a year without my dad was really good for me. I think it's better for me than it was for my older brother. So I went over there after having a whole year of teen independence. And at a time, teens go through this process called the adolescent emancipation, in which they're trying to establish their own personality and their own way of being. And their parents don't particularly like that often and kind of fight it. The parents want to control their teens like they did when they were kids. And the teens are busy establishing their own belief systems and philosophy and self-discipline and all. It's actually a healthy process, but it's often not seen as that by parents. And so I was able to initiate that process independent of my father, which I think helped me. I think it helped make me the strong person that I ended up being. And so once we got over there, I was a pretty self-disciplined kid. I wasn't a kid that acted out and got in trouble and, this and that and the other. And so I got a lot of latitude from him once we reunited as family. And I used some of that to interact with the local culture. I had my first girlfriend. We dated the entire year that I lived over there, and we would go to village festivals and just go around. And our high school had exchange programs with a lot of the Filipino high schools, to where we would go visit them, and we'd go to like lots of them, and then each one of those would come and visit us. And so we made what we called friends. Looking back, they were acquaintances. Some of them were just brief contacts, but it was a nice experience.
Have you been back since? Have you been back to the Philippines?
I have not. My sister did go back.
Okay.
I belong to a Facebook group of people who lived on Clark.
Okay.
And and it includes military personnel, former dependents, and a lot of Filipinos who worked on base then.
Right.
So it's real neat. I'd say pretty much every day I interact with the group in some way. I have misgivings about going back to Clark. The people who do go back, who lived there, let's see, it arouses a lot of very mixed feelings. They're usually glad to see a lot. Of course, a lot of the buildings are skeletons now,
Right.
Because of the volcano. But it's changed so much. It's a big resort center now. So there's high-rise hotels so it's kind of, I have revisited many of the places that I've lived before. And sometimes I give you an example. I lived in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. when I was a young adult. And my wife and I went back there a few years back, and we're driving up and down Rockville Pike, and I couldn't find anything that looked remotely familiar on a route I used to drive on every day. And finally, I spotted the old National Guard Armory. And it's like that one little thing meant so much to me. On something that would never have meant anything to me when I lived there. It was just a familiar landmark that made me feel kind of that elusive sense of home. Right. That third culture kids fight with. And,
well, no, I love that you just mentioned that. Then let me ask you this: then, what in the concept of home is such a crazy thing for us TCKs, third culture kids,
right?
What is your interpretation of the concept of home, even now?
Home always just only meant to me the house I was living in at the time. Yeah. So I usually use the word house. I don't use the word home. So for example, I say I lived in 41 houses by the time I was 19. Yeah. I lived in 27 more houses as an adult.
I got to stop you right there, because I used to think that I kind of led the way living in 27 houses over my 45 years. And no, you blow me out of the water, man. So well played. Go ahead.
So, the house I've lived in Reno. I live in Reno, Nevada now. I've lived here for 16 years. We moved here because my wife found a job here. Right. We didn't think of it as home. We didn't plan on it being home. We just thought we'd live here 4 or 5 years and move back to California, where we had been living. And
that's normal for us TCKs, right? 3 to 5 years, and it's time to move on. I get that. Right. Go ahead.
So, but we kind of fell in love with Reno. It's odd. And we bought the house that we're in now 10 and a half years ago. And I did, I'm a handyman, do-it-yourselfer.
Oh, we're going to get into that. I can't wait to get into that. So yeah, don't worry about that. So go ahead.
So I did a total remodel on this house, and it's a fairly large house. And I mean, total remodel. I did almost all the labor. Well, I did hire somebody to help work with me for several years on it. But in terms of just materials, I spent over $100,000 on materials. So, this is a big remodel. And the process that developed a sense of ownership and belongingness to this house. Yeah. And my wife, like me, is a very she did not grow up as a third culture kid. She lived in 2 houses by the time she was 19.
That's my wife. My wife's parents still live in the same house my wife grew up in. So yeah.
So, very different style. Although it turns out her personality style is a lot like mine. As a young adult,
it's funny you said that, because my wife is the same way. Now, while she only grew up in one house, her mom worked for an airline, so they were able to fly all over the world when summertime hit and school year ends. So she doesn't quite get it, but she gets it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, she probably has the sense of adventurousness.
Absolutely,
that third culture kids have.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Go ahead.
So my wife, in her job, after she went to work when she was 40 years old, she ended up doing a lot of world travel in her job. She ran call centers in 3 in California, 1 in Oregon, 1 in Singapore, India, London, where else? I know another country. I just can't remember it right now. And then she had people that worked for her in Taiwan and Hong Kong, Japan, China.
You're speaking my language, Barry. You're speaking my language. I am a Southeast Asian guy, so I totally understand that. That's awesome, man. Go ahead. I don't mean to keep cutting you off. I'll be quiet.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. It just makes me happy when I hear people that can understand and reciprocate how I grew up and things like that. So it's a smile of joy. Let's put it that way. When you see me smiling.
Yeah, I've traveled a lot to Europe, but I really identify far more with Southeast Asia. I love it. I really enjoy Southeast Asia. There's something, and part of it's their culture, and part of it is their openness to, in general, to interact with other cultures.
100%.
Yeah.
Even now, even in today's crazy world that we live in, they totally understand that and can relate and agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
They're more accepting, I think, than a lot of countries and areas in the world. So Absolutely.
Well, and in general, they tend to be pretty insightful people.
Yeah.
I just wish more Americans, for example, we've traveled a lot to Mexico. I wish
Okay.
more Americans knew what Mexicans are really like instead
Yeah.
of what they hear from their politicians.
Yeah.
Some of their politicians talk about family values. They don't. Americans have no idea what family values are until they go to Mexico. These are people who invented family values.
That's
And
true, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then the people we mostly eat when we go out to eat. It's usually either Thai or Vietnamese are our favorite foods.
Oh, my
Um,
wife would love you right now because that's her favorite food. So that's
oh yeah,
awesome.
good food, good for you.
Yeah.
And everywhere we go, we get to know the owners. In fact, when we went to Thailand, the owners of our local Thai restaurant helped us plot our trip there. And we sat down for several hours, and they'd say, "Okay, go here and go there." And
Mhm.
um, uh, so anyhow, I don't know how we got off onto that, but it's a subject I love to get off on
It's me
talking
too, man.
about.
I could talk to you for hours. I already feel it, but go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So where did we start? I've kind of lost the train of thought on
We
this
we
one.
talked about the concept of home, but I want to progress
Oh
then
yeah,
with the the difference between you and I. I was not raised on a military base. My dad was. My dad actually very similar to you. My dad, his dad was a Normandy first guy in. Talk about career military guy. My dad grew up all over the world on military bases. He was in Japan. He was in Turkey. He was in Europe.
okay.
The list could go on and on. Let's put it that way. His first language was actually Japanese, believe it or not, because they lived in Japan as well. That said, when did you first hear the term military brat and TCK, and what does that mean to you today?
I first heard the term brat when I was probably about 10 or 12, somewhere in that
Okay.
range, and I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I took it as the derogatory word
Yeah.
brat. And finally, I don't know who it was. Maybe it's my dad and mother. I don't know who told me, but they explained that it was just a term. There's a lot of debate about where the term originally came
Yeah.
from. Some people say it comes from the British Army, and I can't remember the exact translation. It was an acronym: British Regimental Army something Transit, I think. And it was, but it's not used in the military about kids in a derogatory way. It's just
Right.
you're a brat, just like
Yeah.
TCK is a
To be honest with
derogatory.
you, I'm considered obviously a TCK just like you are because we lived outside our passport country, but I'm also a business brat because my dad, not necessarily military, but there's a term for that as well. I was a business brat and I didn't know how to take that right away. But just
Right.
like you, I understand it better now than I did when I was a kid. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, at this age, it's almost a badge of honor,
Yeah.
is the way I view the term brat. It's like, well, yeah, of course I'm a brat. I grew up as a military dependent. All military dependents are brats.
Yep.
And nobody ever meant anything bad about it. It's just a term.
Yep.
It's kid. It just translates to kid, a special kind of kid. TCK, I first heard probably only 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And it intrigued me. And so I started doing some research on Ruth Useem. Is that how she pronounced her name? She's the one that did the original TCK
Yeah.
research.
Right.
She and her husband. And it certainly fit, when they talked about the three cultural aspect of being a third culture kid. The parents are people who grew up in one culture and then existed in a second culture. Their kids grew up in the second culture, but interacted with at least one or more other cultures. And then the third aspect, the kids at some time or another, one time or more, returned back to their passport culture, which in many ways was a stranger culture to them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So for me, it's a little bit for brats, it's a little bit more complicated because you were born into that second culture, which is almost like an international culture. It's so different from the native culture.
Yep.
And it's I mean, the Air Force culture is weird. I have a grandson who's in the Air Force.
Okay.
And I don't think he's been in 2 or 3 years now. I don't think he yet realizes how different his life is from the rest of mainstream Americans.
Mm-hmm.
If he makes a career, he will, but certainly his kids will.
Yeah.
And he's already got one kid, so I've got a great grandkid out there.
Wow. Wow.
I've only seen her once, but
Yeah.
then I've got another grandson who is in the Marines. He's been in, I think, 4 years now. And he was stationed in Okinawa for a good while, by the way. And then he dated a gal from Australia for a long time. So, he kind of is the one of the two who is most likely to have the third culture kid lineage going. It's there's a possibility going there that he's already different from other American kids. So right now, what home means for me is 1485 Azure Circle, Reno, Nevada. And it's the first time I've ever considered any place I've lived as home.
Yeah.
After 68 houses, I finally live in a home.
Wow.
I can't say that I consider Reno home. I certainly wouldn't say that I consider Nevada home. Mm-hmm. Reno is a nice city. I really like it. It's known as the biggest little city in the world.
Yep. I've been there many times, so I definitely know it well. So yeah,
it's got a pretty downtown, a river running right through downtown. A whitewater river, no less, running through downtown. It's got a lot of the amenities. It's a highly cultural city, a lot of the arts, and my wife and I are active in some of them. It's got a lot of internationals living in Reno, so any kind of food you want, you can find in Reno. Yep. And owned by people that grew up in some other country, So we've eaten Turkish food grown by, served by a chef, who grew up in Turkey. We have friends that own a Vietnamese restaurant. They're born and raised in Vietnam. We have friends that own a Thai restaurant who are born and raised in Thailand. My next door neighbor owns a Mexican restaurant, and he was born and raised in Mexico. So it's a neat city in that sense.
And I gotta cut in real quick because that's how I feel about Utah. I'm not from here. I wasn't born here. I would come here in the summers because my grandparents lived here. My wife is from here, but same exact thing. Do I feel like a person from Utah? No, right? Yeah, but it's working out, right? It's got everything you just talked about and more. It's a gorgeous city. It's a gorgeous state. I live just outside of Salt Lake City, but yeah, I can relate to that wholeheartedly. It doesn't feel like home, and I think that's more. It's on me. It's just because of the way we grew up.
Right.
Yeah. So I totally relate to that.
Well, my wife is active in state politics, local and state, I guess. And so recently, in the last election cycle, a guy came campaigning to our door. He's running for some local office. I don't remember. Maybe county council. I don't know. But he was bragging that he was a 5th generation Nevadan, as if that were something that would make him a better legislator.
Right.
And we kind of looked at each other and smiled, It's like, what would your great grandfather and grandmother have done that would make you a better legislator?
Sure.
Certainly, there's no information passed down that would have helped them do better. But it was just really the amusement of it. My wife has lived in, I don't know, 5 or 6 states. Okay. I've lived in 12, I think. I've traveled to 48.
Oh, nice.
We've traveled to I think 18 countries for me and 17 for her, which is not that many for a third culture kid.
Yeah. Yeah. Big picture, probably not, but yeah, still.
Yeah, enough to give you a world viewpoint.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
by the way, that was something I had in my notes that I wanted to mention. There was a recent study that my daughter, by the way, has a PhD in social psychology, and so
Wow.
she's always sending me these studies. She's very obviously research oriented
Right.
as I am, and she knows I'm interested in research. And there was this study recently that was done that demonstrated that you only have to live. Let's see how to state this. That it's possible and happens many times that one only has to live out of the country, out of their passport country, for 1 year to have the same level of worldview as somebody who has lived in 20 or 30 different countries.
Yes,
or
sir.
20 or 30 different years. And I just
Yes,
found
sir.
that absolutely amazing.
And I don't doubt that at all, because that's how I feel. I wish there was a way for every. I'm going to just break it down because we're both American. I wish there was a way for every American to spend at least a year outside of this country to truly understand what and why it's, they should be so grateful to be in this country. Right. So I totally, you and I love this, man. I could talk to you for hours. I'm a history geek anyway, but I love the fact that, yeah, you and I are here. I could totally relate to that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I believe that wholeheartedly. It's not me just like making you feel better. I truly believe that in order to truly appreciate what we have here, spend a year outside this country, even a year, just a year, right? Right. And you get a better perspective of what we have and why this is such a great place, because not everybody has what we have, and I think we take that for granted sometimes.
Right. And I think also, were that to happen to more Americans, they would realize how much more we could have
Absolutely.
if we gave up the attitude that we're better than everybody else.
100%. The biggest issue I have, and you could probably relate to this too, because you spent so much time overseas, whether it was living or as a tourist, there's nothing worse to me. My brother and I were raised, you are not better than anybody. You are a guest in someone else's culture. At the time I didn't quite get that, but the older I got and even going back as an adult living overseas, that term ugly American is real,
Yes.
And it's such a negative towards the true core of what we are as people here in the States. But I'm so grateful that my parents instilled in both my brother and I that you are not better than anybody. It's a blessing to be here. You are lucky to be here. Appreciate it. At the time you don't really get it, because my brother and I were pretty young. I was 7, he was 9. Didn't quite get it at the time, but as we developed, as we understood, as we grew up, I think you can ask my brother this too. He lives in New Jersey, and we're on different sides of the continent, but I think he'd even say the same thing, that it's a blessing, man. It was at the time, it's very hard. It's not easy. Let's be honest. It's not an easy way to grow up. But there's so many perks and blessings that come out of it, specifically understanding culture. And I think more than anybody, you and I both, right? We tend to think globally, and we tend to think big picture.
Yes.
And for that, how do you ever, right or wrong, and easy times or hard times, because you and I both know it's not always easy, right? So, but the concept of being able to say you lived overseas and seeing different cultures and different people, there's no price tag on that. There's no price tag on that. It's a beautiful thing. So whether you realize it at the time or not, at some point in your life, you will realize how lucky you were.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, when you're talking, two things came up for me. One is, when you travel overseas, don't hang out where Americans hang out.
Yes, sir.
Hang out where the locals hang out.
Yep.
Go to their museums, go to their places of interest, eat in their hole-in-the-wall restaurants.
Oh, I love it. I prefer it. There's no way. Yeah. I grew up as a McDonald's kid. My dad was in the corporate side of McDonald's. And when we go overseas or try different, countries or go wherever, my parents were like, let's go try the mom and pop shop,
Yes.
And I'm so grateful. I'm still that way. I'd rather go mom and pop shop and go to little noodle shack, whatever, than go to McDonald's and things like that. So I get that.
Yeah. Every country we've gone to, we've made some local friends and managed to be invited into their homes.
Hmm.
Some of these are long-term friendships. I mean, they go back decades.
Yeah.
Um, and as a result of being so multiculturally oriented, even back here in Reno, we have a lot of friends from other cultures.
Right.
Um, and I mean a lot of other cultures, not just one or two. My wife taught English as a second language to a resource center here, and she had women in her course who were from Syria, Afghanistan, the Congo, China, let's see, Honduras, Mexico, country after country after country. We have people, young people. We make a lot of young people friends. People in their 20s and early 30s, from India, China, Egypt, Mexico. And those are just some examples I pulled off the top of my
Yep.
head.
Yep.
I could go on and list and list. And that's something most Americans don't do. These people come over here to study, because one thing we do have good in America is graduate schools. We have
Yep.
some of the world's best graduate schools, and they come over here to study, and Americans ignore them. And what an opportunity to get other cultural experiences while befriending people who are lonely.
Yeah.
And it's just, and they will. We had a young man from Germany live with us for a year on a cultural exchange program, and he's been back to see us 4 times. And
Wow.
we talk with him every week for an hour-long Skype or video, Facebook video, or whatever system we're using at the time. Every week we interact with him. We have a young woman that and her partner in Mexico that we made friends with. That actually they were just getting ready to leave and come up spend 3 weeks with us when COVID closed the borders
Right.
early last year. It's an opportunity not only for Americans to learn more about other cultures and to learn about what other cultures have to offer us, but it's also an opportunity to be a human, a true human,
Yes, sir.
to give the gift of caring and the gift of love and the gift of who we are to each other.
Right.
And so that's, I guess that's the second thing I had. The first one is when you go to another country, interact with them. Don't hang
Absolutely.
around with other Americans. And the other is make sure you get to know other people in your life.
I love it. I love it. What message would you give? I mean, you've done it, you've lived it, you've even gone back, but what message would you give to TCKs and military brats today?
Well, that's, let me make my phone come on. It's,
Sure.
um, bear with me just a
You're fine.
second.
No, no worries. No worries.
Because that was when that was the one that really made me think.
Yeah.
Um, okay, I passed it somewhere. Well, let me just do it from my top of my head.
Sure.
First thing I would say is don't think you'll get over being a third culture kid. You won't. It is who you are. Don't be ashamed of it. Don't apologize for it. I read on third culture kids worldwide and some of the other TCK groups that I monitor. A lot of young people are saying, "Well, I'm always afraid to say anything because they won't get me, or they'll judge me, or they'll make fun of my accent, or they'll this and that and the other." It's like, so what? You are who you are. Express yourself as who you are, and give them the opportunity of learning about you instead of you monitoring and closing down for them.
I love
The
that.
fact is, in life, whether you're a third culture kid or not, if you spend your life trying to please other people or work yourself into other people's graces from their point of view, you're not going to have a very happy life or a very satisfying life. So be the person you are. The other thing is, I read an awful lot of posts and comments on the Third Culture Kid groups about how great, how wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I have no regrets. It was all wonderful. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And I think that's bullshit.
It is bullshit. Yeah.
There was a price to pay. We all paid that price, and we will pay that price long after we're 77 years old, like I'm turning next week.
Yes, sir.
It had its price. But all of life, no matter how you're raised, has its price.
Yeah.
So I think part of being a strong person and using your strength well in life is acknowledging both your strengths and your weaknesses,
yes, sir.
In such a way that you avoid falling back on the worst of your weaknesses and work on converting the best of your weaknesses to strengths.
Yes, sir.
And when I look at my own career, which was a pretty successful career, by the way, I realized that's what I did. I realized that I'm a pretty messed up person. Psychologically, I'm a pretty messed up person, as I think almost all of us are.
We are, yeah.
I really don't know many people that aren't screwed up in some way or another.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so rather than, either denying our shortcomings or our negative experiences, and pretending everything was wonderful, acknowledge a lot of it was wonderful, and a lot of it had a heavy toll on us, but use all of it.
Yep.
So I think that's the best piece of advice I could give to any, particularly to young TCKs who haven't yet kind of found their position in the world. Until you're, way into your late 30s, you're still looking for, where do I fit around here? And you can get a jump start by at least 10 or 15 years by just saying, I am who I am.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so true. I mean, I'm 45 and I'm still trying to figure out some things. I don't think it ever goes away. So I respect that. We have about 8 minutes, and I want to make sure we get a lot of these questions in real quick. We talked about you briefly professionally, but you are a true Renaissance man. You talk about your hobbies and interests. Man, there's not a lot you don't do, brother. Like I am in awe of you. I want to make sure, because even in your bio, when I typed it up, I want to make sure people understood how much you do. Do you think your interests stem from, because I got to say this right. Like you, I have almost too many interests, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that's a product of how we grew up, or is that just something you're naturally, intrinsically, DNA-ish, whatever? I mean, do you think, because you do everything? I mean, there's nothing you don't do, and I
do a lot. I wouldn't say there's nothing I don't do, but I do a lot.
Yeah.
I definitely think being a TCK kid affected that. Mm-hmm. Particularly the number of moves we had. My slightly older brother dealt with them by, he was a pretty aggressive guy. Fortunately for him, he was as tough as he was aggressive. So he handled the moves by, finding the biggest bully, toughest guy on the schoolyard and beating the shit out of him.
Right.
I didn't take that strategy. I'm not wired that way. It's impossible for me to have been wired that way.
Right.
I'm a pretty introspective person. Well, I would say I'm an exceptionally introspective person. And I handled the moves by finding things that interested me and just spending a lot of time on my own doing those things. So, it's lonely when you move into a new school, and there's a certain process you have to go through. And for an introvert, that process is longer than for an extrovert.
Yeah.
So I knew that. I was aware of that from a very early age. And I always liked doing things with my hands, building things. I made model cars and model airplanes when I was a young kid. I fooled around with electronics. When I was 10 years old, my cousin owned a radio repair shop, and he'd give me all the stuff he couldn't fix. And I would take the radios apart and make other radios out of them. I'd check out books in the library about super heterodyne circuitry. And so I just started at a very young age. I sometimes have told people my age, or, adults, about doing this. To them, it sounds mystical. It's like, how could you have done that at 10 years old? Well, I just read a book that told you how to do it. That's how. I mean, anybody who wants to can do almost anything. It doesn't take a genius level of intelligence to do all this. It does take a procedural thought process and an interest. Yep. So, I would do these things. So part of it was an adaptation to the rootlessness life that we lived.
Right.
So as the years went by, I just kept adding more interest to my repertoire and did more things. And now when I was 15, I rebuilt an engine to an old car that my dad bought with a blown engine.
Right.
But then I never messed with cars again until I was, 60 years old. And I started buying some old classic cars. I'd shop around for a car that was mechanically fairly sound, but cosmetically ugly. And I would fix it up. And half the time I didn't know how to fix up what I was doing. So I would, I'd go on YouTube or, somewhere, and, it would teach me how to do that. And over the years, I've now restored, 2 MGB British sports cars, 3 1950 Fords, a 68 Mustang, and I'm starting another. I'm finishing a super high performance MGB now that I designed this high performance engine, and getting ready to start another one. I've always been interested in carpentry. I took woodworking in junior high and high, even though I was on an academic track and took all the, what are now called AP courses, advanced placement courses. But back then, woodworking was considered where you put the troublemakers. And so in high school, I made a 6-foot executive model solid walnut desk, and I won first place in the Kansas State Fair. Right. And a guy offered me the equivalent of about $5,000 for it, and I turned him down because I made it for myself. Yeah. I research a lot. I got interested in alternative energy about 30 years ago, and I designed and built a solar and wind power energy system that powered my farm. We lived on a little farm in Northern California at that time. So it's all done as, like most people of my particular style, I can do a lot of things, and I can do them well, and I can do them productively, but I only do those things that I'm deeply interested in, or that I know I can do or could do. I don't ever pretend that I can do something that either doesn't interest me or that I don't think I could do. I'm not boastful in that sense. Right. I'm boastful in the sense of I will readily admit to my skill levels of what I can do. So, I know almost anything of academic interest I can become expert in, simply because I know the skills of learning. I know how to, I have learned how to learn, which is a skill that I wish our educational system taught.
I agree. And I was a teacher for a long time, so I totally understand that. Listen, Barry, believe it or not, we are actually about 30 seconds in. I'm going to ask you one last question. give me your straight shooter question here, or your answer here. What is something most people don't know about you? You have about 30 seconds.
Oh wow, that's a 5 minute. They actually probably don't know that I'm really a shy person.
It's funny. A lot of us are like that. Yeah, us TCKs
Yeah,
are like that. Yeah,
yeah.
I believe that. I believe that. Well, look, I want to have you back on at some point because this is just too much fun and not enough time. But thank you so much for doing this. I really
Well, thank
appreciate it.
you.
Yeah, please stick around. I'm gonna log off right now, but please stick around. You and I can chat a little bit more. So those of you that are watching, thank you so much. I hope you enjoy this. My mind is blown right now with this man. So Mr. Barry Barnes, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.